said, I'm going to talk today about ethics and religion, and not just about differences in how religious groups approach ethics, but more a little description of how ethics develop in religious groups, but then talk more about how that influences some current political and economic decisions in the European Union, and really some broader cultural and political questions about this. It's kind of more where I'm going with some of this. But first of all, I want to ask you, what are ethics? When you hear that term, ethics, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? What do you think? Responsibility. Okay. What else? So being responsible means you're ethical. What else?
Rules.
Rules. Okay.
Behaviors?
Okay. What kind of behaviors, though?
Ethical.
Ethical behaviors. So if I threw this water bottle, would that be ethical? Okay.
I would say good.
Good behaviors, but good.
No, not good behaviors, but the good. You know?
Okay. So doing things that are in the better good.
Things that can make me achieve good.
But what if achieving your good hurts him?
No, the way to achieve good, of course, not necessarily only egoistic, selfish. Sorry, good, but the good for me as a human person.
Okay. But good for you as a human person could hurt someone else.
Not really. If it does, it's not good.
Okay.
So
Okay.
I'm saying good in a higher sense.
Okay. Okay. What else?
Justice?
Justice. Who defines justice?
Man.
Man defines justice. Is man perfect?
No.
No. Okay. So we see really it's not, even legal systems aren't perfect. So even though we have a legal system and every country's legal system differs, there are a lot of flaws. We have in the United States now more and more people are getting out of prison after being in jail for 30, 40 years because of DNA testing. And they're finding, no, you didn't commit murder. Sorry for your last 30 or 40 years. Sorry.
Sorry.
But at the time, it was the just thing to do to put them in jail for murdering someone that they never even met. And they didn't do the murder. But as you see from all of your definitions, there's lots of ways to define it. And even then, all of those definitions, someone else could probably say, well, what is the responsible thing to do? What is the just thing? What is the good thing to do? There's multiple ways to question all of those. So this idea of ethics, as we see, there's multiple definitions or approaches. And there's no one way to look at it. One thing that we do know is that if we look to the work of Voltaire, if we look to Locke, Bertrand Russell, for example, Gandhi even, all of these individuals and many others have all agreed on one thing. And even then, some people disagree with them. So this is all very philosophical, I would say. Is that the formation of, so how you form your definition of what is or is not ethical, and how you interpret a behavior on whether it is or is not ethical to your definition, is inseparable. It can't be separated for some people from their religious or their spiritual background. Now for some other people, though, their religion or spirituality is completely separate from their ethical behavior. My father, for example, is an agnostic, almost atheist person. He would argue that ethics don't come from someone's belief in some fictitious human being or human beings. He says it comes from just knowing what's right and wrong from lived experience. So for him, this makes no sense. But then he would argue, for example, that the United States would never elect an atheist president, and most European countries probably will never either. Most African, most countries in the world would probably never elect an atheist president because most people believe you need to have a religious or spiritual background to have ethics. But then people like Dawkins, Bertrand, Russell, and others would say, what's wrong with you? You don't have to have that. So even there, we would see there's a relationship here in how we develop our moral or ethical compass in some ways that points to right, maybe not as right, to wrong, and so forth. I did, on this last slide, I had religion and spirituality because they're different. Religion is really organized structures and practices. Catholicism, very organized. One of the most organized Christian faiths. Very much so. There's nothing wrong, nothing right about that. It's just the way it is. We look to say other religious groups may not be as structured. There are new Christian denominations growing in the United States. Some call themselves Christian faith. A lot of Americans now say, I am Christian. Well, what does that mean? Really, they're much more they're much less organized. They're more of a way of living a religion. They're much more spiritual. A lot of people would say Hinduism is much more of a spirituality and less of a religion. But then if you practice some forms of Hinduism, it's very organized, very structured. So really, these are just different ways of looking at this idea of belief and believing in something. And some people would test very high if you look at this from a quantitative perspective. Most of my research is actually very social scientific and very quantitative in nature. There are scales that are used to measure how much you believe and support the structures and practices of a faith. But then it's very hard to tap or measure how much you search for meaning. And a lot of philosophers have looked at really someone's search for meaning and how really that for some people is more important than believing in the structures of a faith. Where I know a lot of Catholics in the United States who consider themselves what we call CEO Catholics, Christmas, Easter only. Where those are really the days when they go. Because they like the pomp and circumstance. They like the big festivities, the music. They also go on Palm Sunday because they get a prop. They get something to take home. That's the structure. That's the the ambiance. That's the ornate. That's the beauty of Catholicism for a lot of Americans now. That's also why religiousness among Catholicisms in the U.S. has gone up and down, up and down, up and down. Same thing in France. But it doesn't mean they're not searching for meaning. They might still be. But the belief in the structures and such has gone like this. When it comes to how the different faiths look at ethics, we need to look a little bit at the faiths, or, at the different religions. A little bit about Christianity as a whole. And here we're looking at Catholicism, Protestantism, the different divisions within the groups and so forth. The single largest faith in the world, over 2.2 billion adherents, and this was in 2010. And even then, these are estimates, because it's not like each country has a big list of how many people are Christian. Some countries try to do that, but most don't. And here, we have Catholics, Protestants, some types of Orthodox Christians, and so forth. Generally, what they share is that they're based on the teachings of Jesus Christ and the Bible. Ethics are partly based on and shaped by the Bible. We'll talk a lot more about that in a few minutes here. But that's where, for a lot of Christians, that's where ethics come from, is what you should and shouldn't do. What would Jesus do? There used to be t-shirts and phrases, WWJD, what would Jesus do? It used to be really popular in the U.S. I did my doctorate at the University of Oklahoma, which is what we call in the Bible Belt. Southern United States, where huge churches, as big as some of these buildings here, gigantic Baptist churches and Methodist churches, and bumper stickers, stickers on the back of a car. What would Jesus do? That kind of shapes your ethic. A map of Christianity. And really, Christian population, 50% or above, a population of less than 10 to 50. And you can really see pretty much dominates North and South America, pretty much so. Europe, it dominates pretty much except in Estonia. You also see part of right here. Where is that? Sorry? Where is this?
Oh my God.
In the middle there. Well, geography, where's this?
Ah, não.
Aquele cor-de-rosa, o cor-de-rosa.
Mongola?
Não,
é
ali.
no meio, é no meio.
Não, ali, aquele cor-de-rosa,
Sibéria.
professor, no meio. É a Sibéria. Não, a Sibéria é lá em
Mesmo
cima.
no centro.
Não.
It's
No, no,
part of the former Czechoslovakia. It's basically, I believe it's the Czech
Oh,
Republic.
no, sorry.
É mesmo ali no meio.
That one.
Yeah.
Okay.
Mas
And then up here,
cor-de-rosa tudo.
Estonia?
no, this here, Estonia's over here.
Yeah, yeah. That one is Belgium.
Belgium. Belgium has fallen below 50% Christian.
It's quite interesting.
And this was recently, this was as of 2010. We see most of Africa, this is mainly Catholicism, most of Africa. Australia, Russia still, Finland where I'm at, see it here. Where we had snow in September, so we're cold. So you see just a map of the Christian world. See, take a look and see. But when it comes to ethics, basically this is one way to look at ethics. How one should lead his or her life. It's kind of a generic way to look at it. Thomas Hobbes argued following a social contract among our peers for social order to avoid a natural hell. Because if we do things that violate social order, it's going to be hell on earth, basically, which we don't want. And you can see it makes sense that Hobbes, Rousseau said something similar because they had the social contract. And that was the best thing. To be ethical is to maintain order. So you can do something that's good for you, but don't hurt them at the same time. That's that balance. Do something that's responsible, not only for yourself, but for others. So that's that kind of ethical thing. Justice. Be just to yourself, but also to others. It's kind of that balance. That's ethics, really, from that Christian point of view. We also have things like autonomy, preservation of relationships, justice, forgiveness, fairness, and vengeance also prevail among the Christian ethic, if we look throughout history. All of these things are widely discussed within the New or the Old Testament, which we look to a lot of our legal systems. Most of them are based on the New or the Old Testament. Even going back to the Napoleonic Code, we see remnants of the Bible in them. And a lot of how you approach ethics really are based on whether you are a New or an Old Testament kind of person. And we see more and more of this developing when it comes to how people interpret legal systems. When they're developing new laws, for example, some people will say there is no gray area, or there is a middle area. And a lot of this goes back to how people interpret texts. And we can see some of this here. When it comes to Christianity, the Old Testament, 39 books, basically how one should live their lives and rules. We have things like Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Deuteronomy, etc. These books, if you've read the Bible, generally God's not the happiest of people in the Old Testament. What we see here is generally a violent and vengeful God who is not very patient or kind in the Old Testament. We see the happier, forgiving, loving God in the New Testament. The Old, he's pretty nasty in some ways, pretty vengeful. In Exodus, for example, we see a vengeful nature of God as he laid waste to the firstborns of Egypt. Basically, the firstborns were wiped out. Leviticus, we see a God who recommends death for disagreeing with one's father or mother instead of negotiation. So if you disagree, you should die. So if any of you have ever argued with your mother or father, you should be dead now. We don't generally hear that verse talked about very much, but you should be if you follow the Bible word for word. Deuteronomy, tolerance for prophets or individuals preaching other faiths is not tolerated and you should die, basically. This isn't just for other faiths, but it's for other ways of thinking. So if instead of going to church, you go and watch a political rally, you should die. If instead of going to church, you watch a movie, you're following a false prophet, a director or an actor. You and your wife have an argument, you and your husband have an argument, you're spending more time with them than going to church. That would follow under Deuteronomy 13. So we see that God's really not leaving much gray area, basically. It's his way or the highway, as we would say in the U.S. So, believe in miracles. Then we have the New Testament. We have 27 books, and here we have a very different way of looking at life. Because here we have autonomy, preservation of relationships. We have issues of justice, forgiveness, and fairness, which come out of the Christ stories. And the books show, for example, in Philippians, Galatians, and Matthew, a very much more forgiving and nice God. Basically, here God is now, okay, people, I'm going to be much nicer to all of you now. It's not all about death and stoning and killing people. And much happier book. A lot of religions now pretty much focus on the New Testament, a lot of Christian faiths. And the Old Testament is seen as outdated and not focused on for some. For example, Paul recommends we consider the interests of all parties in a conflict in 2:4. So if you're having a debate with your family, well, you should consider both sides of the issue and come to a negotiation, which if you compare Philippians with Leviticus is the exact opposite. We also see in Galatians, Paul stressed the significance of accommodating and compromising in conflicts, which is also very different than Leviticus. We also see in Matthew 6:12, we should forgive individuals with which one is in conflict. So we see the issue of forgiveness, which really was not discussed at all in the Old Testament. I mean, for example, Egypt scorned others, so their firstborns were destroyed. Forgiveness was not allowed in this case. And one of the things with ethics is a matter of conflict. If you're in conflict with someone, what is the ethical thing to do? Well, if you're very much so an Old Testament follower, you don't forgive them. We have this debate now in the United States when it comes to issues of the death penalty for crimes, where the idea has been for many states, and it used to be for the federal government, where if you commit a murder, an eye for an eye, which is very much the Old Testament. If you commit death, if you commit murder, well, you should die as well. There is no forgiveness for that crime. Now what's happened is many attorneys over the past 30 years in federal court and our federal Supreme Court, and also in many state and other smaller federal courts, have argued this is a very outdated, and some lawyers have actually said Old Testament way of thinking, where our government should be separated ethically from the Old Testament, even the New Testament, and federal statutes, federal laws should be separate from biblical and other religious teachings. So they made that kind of argument in many ways. Even in Finland, they're trying to make, we don't have the death penalty in Finland, but they've argued that even when it comes to sentencing individuals, there should be a separation when it comes to outdated, as they've said, outdated religious teachings and federal law. Other countries, they've tried to argue that, in many Muslim countries, which we'll talk about as well, is the idea of separating legal decisions from the Quran and many hadiths and so forth. So when we bring those ethical ideas of the New and the Old Testament together, we can see how it impacts conflict within Christianity and how Christians respond to other groups. For example, there are many Christian denominations, particularly among fundamentalist Christians, which are developing more in the United States, Canada, and Australia, and other parts where Catholicism isn't as strong. But even among many Catholics, there are fundamentalist groups where they argue more for the Old Testament, following the Old, not the New Testament, where it does impact how they approach conflicts and how they approach negotiating issues, and also how they interpret law, how they approach politics, economics, and so on. Because for those who look at the Old Testament, there is no in-between right and wrong. Things are right or things are wrong. Fundamentalists, right here, they're strict readers. It's the Old Testament. The New Testament, for many fundamentalists, is an afterthought. It's just kind of this extra thing that was written, which we really shouldn't even follow. So for them, they have harsher consequences for violations. Much harsher consequences. Christians, what we also find in the literature, and what we're also seeing in some historical accounts, are generally much more likely to want to control conflicts, whether they're interpersonal conflicts, or if they're also, say, one nation and another nation, whether they're governmental conflicts.
May I make a question?
Please.
What you mean by, in this moment, by Christians? Christians in general?
In
or
general.
Christians fundamentalists?
Both. Both though. This is the weird finding, is that the ones who are Old Testament are much more likely to control and not budge, not change. But even the New Testament followers are more likely to want to control it and be the ones who win the conflict, but they may give in a little bit.
But you consider that there are different kinds of Christians.
Yes.
Those ones who follow, as you told, the Old Testament and the other ones.
And this is where, this is what the literature has found, and this is where I would say more work needs to be done. Because most of the literature has really looked at, are you Christian, yes or no, what denomination are you? Okay, and they've given them scales or done interviews, but they really haven't looked at how they interpret Christianity. And so this is where a major area of further study could be done, is really trying to understand this better. I think more from a philosophical perspective. This is where one of the limitations is they haven't looked at, for example, that spirituality aspect, how they search for meaning. And one of the things with most faiths and most denominations is they search for meaning in the texts of their faith. So this is where one of the limitations would be of the current literature, which you just pointed out. Yeah. Then we have Islam. It's the second largest religion in the world for now. Predictions are that by 2025, it will probably surpass Christianity. One of the biggest reasons is that Christians in most countries, on average, have probably 1 to 1.5 children per couple, while Muslims, even in non-Muslim countries, have on average 2 to 3 children. And that's in non-Muslim countries like the United States and in Europe. But then if you go to Muslim countries, they're generally having 3 to 4. The same trend happens, say, during the 1600s, where Catholics began to have less children, while then, if you looked at the 1700s, Protestants began to have more children than Catholics in Europe. It's what most historians would say a trend that happens with religions, where they would argue that now Catholicism's time is falling when it comes to being the dominant world religion. And with that, Christianity will not become nothing, of course, but when it comes to being the dominant world paradigm, at least in numbers, will fall, but then economically it will still be probably dominant, of course, for at least a long period of time. But there's a great Thomas Kuhn wrote a great book in 1973 or 74 about scientific paradigms and revolutions, where this is something that just happens throughout time, where science goes through paradigm shifts, politics goes through paradigm shifts, and now religion has gone through the same thing over the past 2,000 or 3,000 years. Different religious groups come, dominate, another group comes, replaces it, and they go back and forth. And we see Islam rising at this point. And some of us are going to be around to see it overtake Christianity as the dominant in numbers. What we see with the faith itself is that it's predominantly based on the Quran and the life and stories of the Prophet through the Hadiths. A map of this. Darker color means more than 50%, and then it goes down. You see it's pretty much almost the exact opposite of the map of Christianity. If you look to Europe, though, you can see France is one of the darkest, along with former Balkan states are pretty dark as well. The United Kingdom is getting fairly dark. Spain is getting a little bit darker. Germany, that whole area is getting pretty dark. Turkey, of course, about 95% or so. Also here, Argentina, Canada is darker than the United States. It's because of immigration policies. Our immigration policies are much more relaxed. See Malaysia, of course, Muslim country. India is fairly Muslim as well. So you have Pakistan, we have this whole area here. Parts of Africa as well. Russia also is a fairly large Muslim population. there any surprises people are looking at?
Yeah. In Brazil,
Oh yeah, what is it?
Which
Guyana.
countries are there?
Guyana and French Suriname, I think. French Suriname and Guyana.
Ghana.
I
Okay.
think it's FG.
Guyana.
Yeah, I think it goes FG and then here's the other one.
Yeah.
But yeah, so. But a lot of this is based on colonization. So basically, a lot of the former colonies in Europe, I would say the former colonizers are now being colonized. And this is part of what's creating a lot of tensions in Europe now, is that countries that used to have colonies, the colonized, are now coming back. This is what happened to France, and when they had colonies in North Africa, also over here and here, they're all now coming in. France is actually now shutting their borders in some ways. Same thing with the United Kingdom. They had colonies a lot here, also had colonies over here, here, and they're all coming in. Germany also has, Germany really had not colonies here, but they had a large worker program after World War II to help rebuild Germany. And so numerous Turks came in, and then once the country was rebuilt, they said, you can go home. The Turks were like, but we like it here. We don't want to go home. And the Germans were like, okay. So they stayed, and they keep coming and having children. And recently Merkel talked about how we should change our immigration policy, change our family reunification policy, and she said if we don't, we will become like those Mediterranean countries. Well, she won re-election by quite a bit, and her party grew on fears of immigrants. Especially fear of not only immigrants, but fear of the Mediterranean countries. And it hurting her economy. It happens in Finland too. They're afraid of the Mediterranean countries. They don't know any better. One of the things to talk about, just very basic, the 5 pillars of Islam. Only one God. Prayer 5 times a day. Almsgiving, so basically giving to the poor, those less fortunate. And a lot of these are very similar to Christianity. Christianity, one God. Not prayer 5 times a day, but one should seek forgiveness, one should pray, and so forth. That's in there. Almsgiving, one should give to those less fortunate than you. Fasting during Ramadan, that's really not in Christianity, but there's fasting during Ramadan. And a pilgrimage to Mecca, called the Hajj. Generally, the almsgiving is to help those who are less fortunate than you make the pilgrimage. So those two are linked very well together, actually. These are the things that to be a good, even then, what is good, to be an ethical or good Muslim one should do in their life. When it comes to ethic, well, generally these are the things that are really focused on. Shame, forgiveness, patience, commanding right and wrong. So basically helping other Muslims know what is right and wrong are essential to being a good Muslim. And these come from the Quran, which was given to the Prophet by the angel Gabriel, who makes many appearances in Christianity as well. So the faiths, as they call them, the 3 desert faiths, Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, are all very well linked together. The hadiths are these stories about the Prophet that are passed down throughout the generations. And what you'll actually find is that many of the arguments for and against wearing the hijab or other garments for women, most of those interpretations come from the hadiths. The Quran will say, actually there's only 2 or 3 passages in the Quran that talk about the wearing of the hijab. And they actually say men and women should protect their modesty. And they mean, like for women, the bosom. You should cover it up. Nowhere does it say women should, like as the Taliban in Afghanistan said, should cover from head to toe. Nowhere did it say that ever. But in some of the hadiths, it said that the wives and the females in the house of the Prophet all wore hijabs hijaba, basically covered themselves from head to toe to protect the women of the household. Basically, the Prophet had his wives and others in the house all cover themselves so no one would know who his wives were to protect from kidnapping. Which at the time, many women were kidnapped for ransom, so it was smart of him to cover all women in the house to protect his top wives, pretty much. Those hadiths were altered, which brings about ethical questions, were altered in many countries, including Saudi Arabia today, and Afghanistan, and Pakistan, and other places, so that, well, if it worked for the Prophet's wives, it works for my wife, and so forth. And some women have said, well, if it worked for them, it works for me. So these are cultural issues, which still brings about ethical questions, and so on. So this is where, for example, in France, they have argued, well, since it's not in the Quran, we can outlaw it. We can outlaw the burqa in all public places, and so on, which opens up a major philosophical debate. When it comes to conflict, shame is a major issue. So in a conflict, what you'll often see, whether it's interpersonal, whether it's a national conflict, one party is likely to disrespect the other. And this happens quite a bit. Always happens in a conflict. If we disagree, someone will disrespect the other person. But when one feels shame, conflict escalates. Think about this. If you were to have a disagreement with someone and someone makes a mistake, the other person is going to feel embarrassed. And so what might happen is the conflict may escalate over something stupid. A silly little argument or a silly little statement because someone just doesn't want to admit they're wrong and say, yeah, I messed up. So one of the things that the Quran and also some hadiths talk about is the issue that to avoid this escalation, because what happened before the Prophet united the Arabian Peninsula is that many tribes would fight one another and kill an entire tribe over these little tiny problems. Is that he said we should all try to just solve this and compromise, and he actually made people compromise or he would get involved, and that was never pretty. Because he wanted them to just be united as one Arabian Peninsula. So this idea of compromise is important. We also see forgiveness. Really, the Quran itself is a really, if you ever get a chance to read the Quran, even in Portuguese, it's a really beautiful text. It talks quite a bit about forgiving your enemy. It's really when you see some of the phrases we hear about that aren't very nice, those come from some of the hadiths. It talks a lot about Allah being forgiving, a merciful person. It really says, we should not control issues. We should be very open. We should be very forgiving. We should be very, just let things happen as they go. We should collaborate. We should resolve our conflicts. We should seek forgiveness of others. So really nothing like the Old Testament. Very much so New Testament and even more. So we also have patience, sabr. Don't rush to judgment. Contemplate the situation. We see this in the 1979 Camp David Accords, when we had the former head of the PLO, Yasser Arafat. We had the head of the Prime Minister of Israel at the time, and Jimmy Carter meeting in the United States. And one of the frustrations the President of the United States had was that Yasser Arafat would spend hours and hours, even a couple of days sometimes, trying to figure out one issue. And it frustrated the American delegation because they're like, why is he spending so long? And later on they found out because he said, I can be very patient to resolve this issue to the best of my knowledge and for the best of all the parties involved. So sometimes what you'll find is that to be the most ethical in a decision, it can take a long time to solve and find the best resolution. And this is something, especially in business negotiations with Muslims, that can take longer because they're really focusing on possibly seeking guidance from a third party, possibly just really trying to understand the issue. Because for them, patience is on their side. Commanding right and wrong, really try to help others be more morally just. If you see an unjust act, it's your job to really help them correct it. You'll see this when it comes to, I saw this when I was in India. I was in a predominantly Muslim state, Gujarat, which is right on the Pakistani border. And it's very common to see Muslims correct other Muslims' children. Because you're not doing a good job, so come over here, smack them. You won't see very many Christians do that in the United States because they'll be afraid of getting in trouble. But in this communal atmosphere, it's ethical for them to correct that bad behavior because it looks bad on all of them. You just don't see that in Finland either. They're afraid of, it's not my kid. Can't do anything. So, but for them, it's all of their children, which is very different. Also the same thing with the research, which probably needs more research done on it. You see more collaboration and avoidance from Muslims generally in conflict situations than you do from Christians. At least is what the research has shown. I think even more work could be done looking at that. The final thing is just this broad issue for us to look at is Islamic-Christian relations in Western Europe, looking at how the two come together. There's a long history of Muslim-Christian relations in Europe. Not always pleasant, but not always negative either, if we look throughout time. We see a lot of times where the two have coexisted very pleasantly, but sometimes not very pleasantly. Immigration is rapidly increasing too. We see in some countries where Muslims now make up between 5 to 20% of predominantly Christian countries, and that's happened in the past 5 to 20 years in some places. So it's rapidly growing in some countries. Italy is now one of those countries that's really trying to deal with it, particularly since the conflict in Syria has emerged, where more and more Syrian refugees are trying to escape to Italy. And so we'll see the Muslim population in Italy grow rapidly, I bet, over the next 5-10 years. And this brings about issues, economic issues, political issues, social, geographic change, which some people like, some people really hate. And so that creates some problems. Muslims, one of the things we see though is the reason they're growing so fast is they generally have a higher birth rate. We also see, unfortunately, they have a higher unemployment rate in most countries, which does create economic problems in a lot of places. If we look to France, one of the things you'll find is that typically Muslim immigrants have a higher unemployment rate. And what studies have shown by the government or by private researchers and so forth is, while many will look for jobs, if they send a resume in with the name Muhammad or Fatima on it, their chances of getting an interview are by far less than someone with the name Sophie, because they have a Muslim name. And so we see discrimination rising, which does impact things like unemployment and so forth. But not with every company, but companies like Peugeot are now asking applicants not to put their name on resumes to try to fix things like this. So we see these kinds of things happening. So we see it with discrimination, prejudice, and stereotyping. But I think it's the case with any kind of immigration. We saw the same thing in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s, and 70s in France when it came to Spanish and Portuguese immigrants. For many of them were discriminated against because of their names when it came to hiring. But the new group to discriminate against are religious minorities. And that brings about the ethical question. Is that ethical? Well, some in France would say, yes, it is, because it protects the greater French good. To give the jobs to French Catholics, not to these new immigrants. But then going back to definitions of ethics, you have to ask, well, for some it is good, for others it's not. So there's that balancing act to consider.
But this is quite, I'm sorry.
Please, someone.
You know why? The reason why Muslim population is discriminated today in France might have the same reasons why the Portuguese and Spanish population were also discriminated. It's because of the difference, I wonder what's the importance of the religious difference.
I think that
Because it's much more deeper than that, and I think that's where the point is.
Cultural difference.
I think in France it has a lot to do with, in France part of it is the religion. I think if you look to France, it has this long history of secularism, where for them, religion should have nothing, at least on paper and for a lot of the French, should have nothing to do with the government. And really your religion is something you have inside of you. It's not something that should be worn. It should be seen really in public and should not be a big part of you. Because I think one of the things they're afraid of is that if people start to be overtly too religious, it could escalate and grow into 1760 again, where we then have the Catholic Church who controls 50-60% of the land along with the monarchy, and the people have nothing because the church has everything with the monarchy again. Which wouldn't happen, but that's what they're afraid of. Because in France, if you are a priest, you don't swear allegiance to Rome anymore. You still don't. Your allegiance is first to the French government to this day. And that's still the practice in France. And what they see now with Muslims coming in is that for many of them, it's still visible. They can still visibly see, because you'll still see in Paris, you'll still see not as many as you will in London. Still see women wearing the hijab. It's still, they're more visible. Also because more and more of them are not white. And so it's visibly changed the people who are coming in, where they also know that these people are not as secular. So I think their secular paradise in some ways, some researchers have argued, even some French researchers have argued, the secular paradise that has been France is becoming less secular, and it threatens the very foundation that has been France since 1790 in some ways, which scares some people. And some would argue they're probably overreacting, but we see the same thing happening in Germany, where the idea isn't as secular, but just the idea that a new population is coming in, which is religiously and culturally different. I mean, in France, they're linguistically about the same. They speak a different dialect than Parisian, but they're linguistically about the same. Many of them are from former colonies, which actually weren't colonies, they were départements. But talk to a lot of French people on the street, some of them would even say, why do they have to be so Muslim? And it comes down to the religion issue for a lot of people. For some it is just an issue of they're just different. So it's not, you can't just say it's one thing, you're right, but I think a lot of it does come down to religion for them. Especially in France because of the secular issue. But I think with the Portuguese and the Spaniards, it was just they were from another country and they were taking jobs away, and the unemployment was going up as well during that time. So whenever unemployment goes up, people don't want foreigners. That's what's happening in the United States.
Can't it have nothing to do with an impulse to protect their own identity as a country, as a people?
Well, I think that's part of the secularness is part of their identity, and they're afraid of losing that, I think.
Can I ask, what is the main reason why Muslim people go out of their countries to come to Europe?
Well, I think a lot of it has to do with economics in a lot of places. A lot of the countries are coming from economically are not as strong. In France, a lot of them are going to France because France was the country that many of their parents grew up as. France was the motherland. In Algeria and Tunisia, most of the immigrants to France come from Tunisia and Algeria, and also partially from Morocco or Libya. And many of them were at one time or another linked to or controlled by France. So for them, it's like, we're going to where our parents knew as home. Because they were actually not a colony of France, they were a département, they were like a region of France. So it's like not that foreign to them. They also speak French. So they're going to the big city almost, in some ways.
So if we expel them, we are obviously hurting them, right?
And some,
We are
that's what they would
causing
say,
some
yeah.
hurt.
It's like expelling Angolan people and Cape Verdean people from here.
So there you have a great example, because it has nothing to do with religion, and
Yes.
you find this big discrimination issue
With what now? Okay.
with the Angolians
The
and
African
Angola.
people in Portugal,
Yeah.
from the colonies.
And I think that is one way to look at it. That's another way to look at it, yes. But if you talk with a lot of French, especially a lot of French who are still Catholic, like still practicing Catholics, they will say the Muslims are changing the secular identity of France. I think also it can come down to economics. It can also come back to the colonists coming back, which is they're afraid of changing France. You don't find it as much in the UK because many of them they've had this long history of the colonists coming back, so they don't worry as much about that. They don't have that secular identity there. They have a state church, so they're much more like, whatever. Immigrants are coming in.
The labor market also requires the immigrants to function, so.
They do. And the UK has the market which requires it. France does too, though.
So
That's something.
No, well, most of them are not immigrants anymore because they
Not
are
anymore, right.
they are French. They are nationals.
They're second or third generation. Yeah, that's the thing too. They're second or third generation, and they're still like, why are you here? I was born here. My father was born here. I just happen to be Muslim. Well, can't you be less Muslim? Why can't you be less French? So we have the same thing in the U.S. with Mexican immigrants, but there it's not about religion. It's more about economics and language for the U.S. And in Germany, it is kind of about religion, but not because of the secularness, just because they're different.
And can I ask why United Kingdom doesn't seems to have this kind of issues? So
I think they're because they for years have had people from India, Pakistan, and Bangladesh coming in, and they also didn't have, even though the partition of India was bloody and violent, it wasn't seen as, it wasn't regarded as badly in the United Kingdom as the Algerian Civil War was. I mean, the Algerian Civil War was regarded by many French people as, how dare you leave us? What gives you the right to leave us? As how, you're France. Well, what's wrong with you? Oh, they're like, what's wrong with you? Why would you ever want to leave? You're just. And for the British, they were like, well, economically, this is going to hurt, but they're so far away, we can't really control them. And the Algerians were so close that they just took it more personally, the French people. And now they're coming in, they're like, okay, you didn't want to be part of us, and now you're coming here, and you're Muslim, and we're secular. There's all those variables combined. Like in France, they call them the pied noir, the Blackfeet, which is not a positive thing to call, it's a derogatory, a negative term. And granted, many British, call, the Pakistanis negative things, but it's just they just had that long history of immigration between the two. And it's just a variety of factors just worked well where, there is prejudice and stereotypes, of course, in the UK, but there's just not as bad. Even in Germany, it's not as bad. See, really, you have France over here, Germany in the middle, and the UK over here when it comes to acceptance. But then you have the US kind of closer to Germany, and after the bombings in 2005, the UK was over here, and now they're moving over here. But then if the economy starts to go bad, the UK will move over here. Economics will push anything. Like if the unemployment rate gets better in France, they'll become a little bit more accepting. Same thing in Germany and the UK. Money matters with everything. When we look at this, one of the things also that's mattered is immigration policies. Just a few things to wrap up here. The Netherlands has recently raised the age at which a person can bring their partners. Used to be if you're 18 years old, working in a country, you were married, an immigrant from wherever, you could bring your partner over. Now it's 21. And also you must make 121% of the minimum wage. It used to be just make minimum wage, now you have to make 120% over it. Germany, they have increased their focus on temporary immigration. So you can move there just temporarily, especially from outside the EU. So it's harder to get a permanent residence permit in Germany now. And they're focusing more on, once you get there, integration policies, where people must learn German within a certain period of time or gone. Spain, more effective deportation procedures have been put in place. Greater access for security forces into municipal registers. And the limitation of rights to reunite families. So they've taken these steps, particularly since the bombings, so forth. And also France, selective immigration. They've limited the number of people who can come in legally from certain countries. Immigrants must learn French within a certain period of time, but most from Algeria and Tunisia speak fluent French, so it's not an issue. Except political cartoons, so there can be no protesting over political cartoons of, say, the Prophet Muhammad. If you are protesting over that, you are arrested. Women must provide uncovered photographs for ID cards and be seen by male doctors, not female doctors. And a more selective process of immigration that entails things like DNA testing. All immigrants must go through DNA tests, no matter where they're from, and language examinations. And the prime ministers and presidents in each nation have called such policies the ethical thing to do, like Sarkozy called it an ethical thing to do to maintain social order. So did Merkel. I love that she didn't say to maintain, but she called it an ethical thing in a Spiegel. Ethical thing. So here we see this idea of ethical. It's an ethical thing to do, these policies. Some totally agree. Others, especially things like DNA testing. It's not I haven't had to go through DNA testing in Finland. I didn't have to have, needles put in me, and that just scares me, a needle. But to be an immigrant, to have a needle poked in you. I got fingerprinted for the first time when I went to Finland. Even going into the U.S., my Finnish friends say they have to have the fingerprints and things like that. Those kinds of things for security measures, I guess I can see, but I've never been fingerprinted before. So I became an immigrant. And now going back to the U.S., they say, So where do you live now? Finland. Oh. Get put in a different line sometimes. It's like, oh my goodness, I feel like violated. So, I mean, what are your thoughts on this just from an ethical perspective? What are your thoughts?
I think France is, well, I don't know, putting a step forward to destroy the very concept of ethics. What is ethics nowadays in French? It doesn't seem very orthodox, I don't know. It's true, it's not easy to define the concept of ethics, but I don't know if it applies all the description that you
Yeah.
mentioned. If most probably, if you ask to each one of us, probably not many of us would agree that it would be very ethical to do DNA tests
Yeah.
on someone. I don't know.
Well, some of these have been challenged at the European Court. I forget what it's called. You probably know what's the European Court. Yeah, the European Court. Yeah,
Human rights.
yeah, because some of these policies violate EU Charter. But each country, that's part of the problem and the beauty of the EU, is each country has their own laws, but then their EU policies, and some of them violate EU policies.
You must interpret the charter on the basis of the constitutional experience of each country.
Yeah.
So
And how is that really with ethics, where we have an EU that says this, but then countries that say, let's say that. So there's another.
I think that the only, I think from the moment that they let them in their country on, in order to not contradict themselves, they have to treat them just like they treat any other person. So I think the only legitimate solution would be not to let them, not to cause them any harm, but only not to let them harm them. Only if this balance would be possible, which I don't know if we can put it this way, because I don't know. But I think if they let them in, then they are saying, okay, we trust you, you won't harm us, and you are just like one of us. If you treat them differently now, you are contradicting yourself. So you are letting them on only because of what? To keep the appearances, not to seem to Nazi or something.
Yeah.
So this is,
Okay.
I think it's a matter of coherence.
Okay. Yeah.
I'm finding somewhat confusion. I'm a little bit confused with the difference between prejudice and ethics, because well, not under my point of view, but from what I have heard, mainly on this France
Yeah.
issue, much of what has been said has to do with prejudice, I think,
Okay.
and not with ethics.
Well, I think one of the things is a lot of the laws that they've passed, people have called them very prejudicial. They've said that they're very much based in prejudice. And so the question is, if you pass a law that is deemed prejudicial, is that ethical? Well, then the question comes down, that's the first question. But then how you answer that is, the government would say, of course it is, because we're protecting ourselves. It's not prejudice, because we're protecting ourselves. It has nothing to do with how we regard the person, how we regard the group, how we think about them. It has nothing to do with that. It's just protecting our society, protecting our economy, protecting people from terrorism. It's protecting us. But then those who the law affects would say, no, it's not ethical, because the only reason you made that law is because you're attacking us. So it's a matter of how they interpret things, I think is the way to look at it. Where in the United States, for example, after the terrorist attacks on September 11th, our government passed a huge law, basically changing security in the United States forever, pretty much. Where now we can go into any religious building we want without telling the group, and put monitors in the building, and basically we can bug it, we can arrest people and detain them for 72 hours without telling them why. And the only people who are really that happens to, it won't happen to someone like me, statistically. I'm white, a male, I'm not Muslim. It probably would never happen to me. all the reports we've heard about who that happens to whenever we hear about it are generally Muslim men, Hindu men. They're generally people who would look like the people on the plains on September 11th. And therefore, people who argue against the laws that were passed after September 11th argue that the laws were prejudicial and that they were written to pretty much single out, focus on certain types of groups. And so they would ask, is that ethical to write laws that pretty much give the government unparalleled power to do whatever they want to people without any punishment to the law? Because we can't sue our federal government pretty much. We can't take action against them. So is that ethical, really? That they can make a law that's deemed prejudicial? But the government has responded saying, there's nothing prejudicial about this. We're protecting our country. We've saved how many lives? Then we have, someone like Edward Snowden who came out and said, really, look at what you've done since that date. Look at the benefit you've had. Look at who you've spied on, and so forth and so on. So that's where the two come into play. Does that help?
Probably Sarkozy's decision is not, from his point of view, of course he speaks about ethics, but from his point of view, probably his decision is not based on ethics or even on law, because we know what European law is, but probably just in politics. You talked about social order, and for many thinkers, for many politicians, this is just a political concept,
Totally.
a politics conceived without ethics.
It's all, a lot of it is about politics. Like our Patriot Act, the one after September 11th, was all about politics. Where, has it made us safer in the U.S.? I don't know. Maybe, maybe not. But our politicians loved it. And the American people loved to hear how safe we are now. The voters ate it up. Everyone who voted for it got reelected. People who voted against it, very few of them got reelected. And since then, we've renewed parts of it that have been challenged. Good luck. We recently found out that Angela Merkel's telephone was bugged by our NSA, by our National Security Agency. She's upset. She has every right to be upset, but that was allowed by the Patriot Act. So is that ethical to really, for our government to spy on on the leader of Germany? I mean, but that allowed it. But it was all politics. It was all political decisions. We were attacked. We must now make it easier for us to do anything we want to people we don't like. They didn't say it that bluntly, but that's what they meant. And pretty much it was anyone who's dark-skinned and has a name that doesn't sound white Anglo-Saxon. Kind of what's happened. So whenever I go to an airport, I had an attorney friend of mine who deals with immigration issues, and they said, when you go to an airport, Stephen, and I try not to do this, but they say our security do profile at airports. They do it, I think every airport does it. They profile people. We arrived here, and we saw the people getting off the plane pulling a few people aside and asking them questions. None of them were white. None of them looked Portuguese. They all looked Muslim. And I was like, wow, that's not random. Same thing in the U.S.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not ethical, but that's the prejudicial part.
Well, we must finish. But just one word. On the other hand, I think I don't agree with those people who defend politics without ethics. But on the other hand, I think religions and different religions may be good contributors to the debate, and probably we will see people from different religions agreeing in many things.
Totally, the dialogue is necessary.
And the dialogue, the
We
question of dialogue,
yeah.
which is very important.
It's totally necessary. And we see some elements of that in the U.S. and in France, and especially in the U.K., where they have some organizations that promote dialogue every year with members of parliament and so forth. So we see some of those things happening. It's just a matter of we need more of that to really promote more ethical behavior and just more communication.
Yeah.
Because if we don't talk, we don't understand the other.
Well, it's a very interesting. Yes.
I would like to say regarding this Muslim-Christian issue, I think that the question posed in that way, a big difference and opposition between Christian and Muslim world, is an ideological construct for another thing that's happening. Because you see, if some very rich man from Arabia, Saudi Arabia, or Pakistan or something, or one football player coming from Algeria or something, or an artist who wants to come in to France and live there, there will be no problem. And that shows that this is an economical and classist question, mainly. And the whole religious thing, of course, it has its importance, very big importance. But I think it is mainly in what concerns European countries like France or Spain or Italy. I don't know in the U.S. Perhaps in the U.S. the religious question has more importance than in Europe. But in Europe, I think it's an ideological construct to impose an economical order.
I think economics decides that it is inseparable. It goes hand in hand with it. And I think that you're right. Someone goes into France who's very wealthy or has a good job and money will do very well. But I still think if they're overtly religious, they'll run into problems. More than if they were not very religious. I think they'll still have those problems, but they'll be more accepted if they're economically sound. But I still think the religion could hurt them. But if they're more accepted, they'll be more accepted. Yeah, exactly. So economics is important. So, yeah.